If you want to understand a society's entire civilization, its economy, its culture, the way its people interact with each other on a daily basis, just look at what they consider their ultimate authority.
Right, because that ultimate authority determines the entire architecture of their lives. It's the blueprint.
Yeah, exactly. Don't look at their art first.
Yeah.
Don't look at their gross domestic product. Look at what or who they actually submit to when the chips are down and, resources are scarce.
Whether society defines its ultimate authority as, say, a pantheon of deities, or a rigid constitution, or maybe the invisible hand of the free market, or even a military dictator, that foundational blueprint dictates everything.
It really does. It determines who gets fed, who goes to prison, who is deemed essential, and who gets to make the rules in the very first place.
Exactly. It's the core engine of everything else.
It is the ultimate sociological litmus test.
Yeah.
And that striking premise is exactly where we are starting today.
We are looking at a deeply fascinating, incredibly dense, and highly controversial lecture given by the Islamic scholar Allama G.A. Parwez. This is back in January of 1981.
Right. He is analyzing a very specific section of ancient text, Surah Az-Zumar, which is the 39th chapter of the Quran, specifically looking from verse 67 to the end of that chapter.
But here's the critical mission for this deep dive. For you listening right now, we are going to analyze this entire lecture completely through a structural, rational, and socioeconomic lens.
Yeah, we are stripping away the traditional mystical or purely theological interpretations, just entirely putting those aside.
Exactly. And to be incredibly clear up front, we are not here to endorse Parwez's specific ideological framework or, to make any sort of theological rulings.
Definitely not. Our goal is just to impartially unpack the actual mechanics of his argument. And his argument is radical.
Highly radical. According to Parwez, to actually understand the profound claims being made in this text, you have to look at it as a concrete blueprint for human civilization.
Right, not just a manual for private spiritual rituals, which is how it's often treated.
To really set the stage here, I think it helps to understand exactly what Parwez was doing in 1981.
Yeah, what was the context? Because 1981 was a very specific time, globally and specifically in South Asia.
It was. He was operating in a context where traditional religious orthodoxy was heavily emphasizing the afterlife, private piety, and basically acceptance of the social status quo.
Basically telling people to just put up with their earthly suffering.
Precisely. And Parwez fundamentally rejected that approach. He built his entire intellectual framework on the assertion that over centuries, the original vocabulary of the Quran had been fundamentally misinterpreted.
He argued that the language was essentially hijacked, right?
Yeah, exactly. He said it was hijacked, taking this grand, universal socio-economic vision and shrinking it down into a tiny, private, individualistic practice.
So to understand his structural argument today, we have to immediately redefine the ground rules and, well, the actual vocabulary we're using.
We do. We have to wipe the slate clean on a lot of these words.
Let me stop you there, though. Because the traditional interpretation of these words is so deeply ingrained. When I hear a word like worship, I automatically think of a designated building.
Right. A mosque, a church, a temple.
Yeah. A specific day of the week, maybe chanting or, silent prayer. It's an isolated binary action. You're either worshiping or you're doing something else.
It's treated as an event, a spiritual event.
Exactly. So if Parwez is saying that entire paradigm is a mistranslation, what is the actual linguistic mechanism he uses to redefine it? Because he can't just wave a wand and change a dictionary definition.
He doesn't wave a wand. He actually goes straight to the classical Arabic root words. That's his entire methodology. Let's look at that word worship, which is ibadat in Arabic.
Ibadat.
In common modern parlance, worship is a private transaction between an individual and their deity. You feel an emotional connection, you perform a ritual, and then you go back to your day.
Often a day spent participating in a completely ruthless economic system.
Exactly. But Parwez looks at the linguistic root of ibadat, which is ain badal, ABD.
What does that root actually mean in classical Arabic?
In classical Arabic, a primary meaning of this root is to pave a road, to make something subservient, smooth, and functional for travel.
Wait, like literal infrastructure?
Literal infrastructure. A paved road is called muwabad. Therefore, Parwez argues that ibadat is not a private emotional ritual. It actually means adherence to a practical constitutional system.
So, following the paved road, adherence to a system, not just a feeling in your heart or, a sequence of physical movements in a quiet room.
Right. It means taking the laws of that ultimate authority and actively applying them to the tangible structures of society. It's about how you lay the pavement for civilization.
That is a massive shift. So it's about system.
It dictates everything: how you run your courts, how you structure your economy, how you distribute resources, and how you design your social safety nets.
So if Ibadat worship isn't just about you in a room praying, but about how you participate in the socio-economic structure of your civilization.
Then the object of that worship has to change too.
Right. The word for God, or Ilah, also has to mean something entirely different in this context. It logically follows.
It does. And that is Parwez's second major redefinition. He defines Ilah not as a mystical deity to be privately worshipped in a void, but as the ultimate sovereign authority.
So it's not a conscious being sitting on a cloud receiving our praises.
No, in this framework, it represents an infallible law. It is the supreme source of legislation.
So when the text talks about submitting to this authority, in Parwez's structural reading, it means submitting to a universal, rational, socio-economic constitution.
Exactly. A constitution that ensures absolute justice. It's not about emotional devotion. It's about structural obedience to a system that guarantees equity for every single human being.
I want to push back on this a bit, or at least, try to visualize the mechanics of it.
Sure.
If we are defining ultimate authority as an infallible, immutable law, how does that actually play out? Because Parwez compares this to the laws of the physical universe, the cosmos.
He does, quite heavily.
But the cosmos and human society seem like two completely different arenas, operating under totally different rules. I mean, physics is math. Human society is chaos.
Parwez bridges those two arenas using a foundational concept called rububiyya.
Rububiyya. Okay. How is that traditionally translated?
Traditionally, it's often translated as divine sustenance or nourishment, usually framed in a very abstract or spiritual sense, like God spiritually feeding the soul.
But I'm guessing Parwez brings it firmly down to earth.
Very firmly. He frames it as a tangible, universal system of development and nourishment. He basically asks us to look at the physical universe, the cosmos, nature, the planetary systems.
Wow.
It all runs on immutable, unchangeable laws: thermodynamics, gravity, electromagnetism, the strong and weak nuclear forces.
These laws are absolute. They do not take bribes.
Exactly. They do not discriminate based on your zip code, your race, or, your bank account. They perfectly sustain the physical universe and keep it from collapsing into utter chaos.
The physical universe operates in perfect, unquestioning submission to these laws. It doesn't have a choice. I mean, if I drop an apple, it falls. Every single time.
Gravity is an absolute, immutable, sovereign authority over that apple.
Yeah, it doesn't matter if I'm a billionaire CEO or a person experiencing homelessness. If I step off a cliff, gravity treats me exactly the same way. There is zero preferential treatment.
And that right there is universal sovereignty in the physical realm. Parwez argues that human society, if it is to actually survive and thrive without destroying itself, must be governed by an equally immutable, rational, socioeconomic constitution.
Okay, so true sovereignty in a societal context means being accountable to no one except this ultimate universal law.
Precisely. In a functioning, just society, every human administrator, every ruler, every corporate executive, no matter how powerful they seem, is completely accountable to this constitution.
They are not the sovereign. The law is the sovereign.
The strict political science definition of sovereignty that Parwez points to is accountability to none. Only the ultimate infallible law holds that status. Everyone else is merely an administrator of that law, completely bound by it.
But here is the massive hole in that comparison, in my opinion. If we're comparing societal laws to gravity, if I try to defy gravity, I fall immediately.
Right, the consequence is instant.
It's instant, objective, and undeniable. The universe gives me immediate feedback. But humans defy economic justice all the time. We see it constantly.
We absolutely do.
People hoard massive amounts of wealth. Systems ruthlessly exploit workers, leaders launch unjust wars for resources, and the people pulling the strings seem to get away with it for decades.
They often do.
They live their entire lives in absolute luxury, insulated from any negative consequence, and then they die peacefully in their sleep. They don't fall off a cliff. So if this socioeconomic law is supposed to be like a universal law of nature, why doesn't it have the same immediate, undeniable enforcement mechanism?
That is the crucial tension of human existence in Parwez's framework. It's a great question. And he addresses this delay in consequences by bringing in another heavily loaded Arabic term, Shirk.
Shirk. Historically, that is translated as polytheism, right? Like the theological sin of believing in multiple gods or idols, bowing to statues, things like that.
Exactly. But remember our lens today. We are strictly looking at structural socioeconomics. So Parwez looks at the root of shirk, which is shinrakaf, S-H-R-K.
And what does that root mean?
It means to share, to associate, or to create a partnership. He argues that in societal terms, shirk is when humans take their own arbitrary, flawed, self-serving laws and elevate them to the status of immutable, unquestionable authority.
So they are effectively creating a partnership with, or entirely replacing, the universal law.
Exactly. It's not about bowing to a stone statue in a temple. It's about bowing to a flawed human system.
Oh, wow. So it's lobbying to rewrite the tax code so you pay 0% while the working class pays 30%, and then treating that tax code as if it's an inviolable law of nature.
That is exactly it. It's when a human elite assumes the unaccountable power that should strictly belong only to the universal law of equity.
You essentially make yourself a false god of the economy.
Right. And you asked earlier why we don't get immediate feedback like defying gravity? Parwez's answer is that humans have constructed massive artificial systems of shirk to insulate themselves from the consequences of their structural defiance.
They build a buffer.
A huge buffer, a buffer of arbitrary human laws justified by force or tradition or incredibly complex financial systems, all to protect their hoarding.
So they create a corporate veil, a militarized border, a rigged legal system where they are fundamentally unaccountable.
They are essentially setting themselves up as the Ila, the ultimate authority over other humans. They absorb the shock of their own injustice through these systems so they don't personally feel the consequences.
Let me make sure I'm synthesizing this correctly for the listener. Instead of a society governed by an impartial law like gravity, we have a society governed by the whims of a few elites who have basically declared themselves the force of gravity for everyone else.
That is the exact mechanism.
They have built an entire architecture to delay the cliff drop.
They have. And this leads Parwez to his sweeping diagnosis of why the modern world, despite all its technological advancement, remains in a state of perpetual crisis and profound inequality.
Because the buffer is inherently unstable.
Yes, he calls it the destructive dualism. This is his massive critique of the existing global order. And what is fascinating here is that he targets both modern secularism and traditional religious escapism with the exact same critique.
I definitely want to dig into that, because secularism and traditional religion usually view themselves as absolute opposites. They're always at each other's throats.
Usually.
How does he critique both of them at the same time using this concept of dualism?
Well, he points out that, structurally speaking, both systems share the exact same core flaw. Let's look at the secular materialist worldview first.
Okay, let's look at the secular side.
It perfectly accepts that the physical universe, the cosmos, cellular biology, physics, is run by strict, immutable scientific laws. No secular economist or politician would argue that the speed of light changes based on who is measuring it.
Right. Gravity works the same for a socialist and a capitalist.
Exactly. But when it comes to human society, to the economy, to the distribution of resources, that same secular worldview believes we can just run things based on the arbitrary whims, theories, and power struggles of human elites.
They acknowledge absolute law in the sky and in the laboratory, but they completely accept chaotic, human-made dominance on Earth.
They split the universe in half. One half gets absolute, impartial mathematical law. The other half gets a Darwinian struggle for power where the strongest dictate the rules.
That's the dualism. The split. Now, what about traditional religion, especially the highly mystical or escapist variants that Parwez is so critical of?
He argues they do the exact same thing, just masked with different terminology.
How so?
They accept that God's immutable laws run the cosmos. The stars move by divine law, the rain falls by divine law. But when it comes to human society, instead of establishing an equitable socioeconomic system based on those laws, they relegate religion entirely to private rituals.
They say, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's.
Exactly. They tell the masses to focus on purifying their souls, seeking a mystical connection with the divine, or, preparing for the afterlife.
While completely ignoring the fact that human elites are starving them and hoarding the world's resources right now.
Right. It's an abdication of structural responsibility.
I have to play devil's advocate here on behalf of traditional mysticism. Because what about the argument that mysticism offers profound mental peace, psychological resilience, and deep personal transformation?
It certainly provides coping mechanisms.
Millions of people rely on quiet contemplation, prayer, or a mystical sense of connection to simply survive the hardships of life. Isn't there immense value in that? Parwez takes a pretty sharp swing at certain mystical traditions in this 1981 lecture, specifically mentioning figures like Rumi.
He does take a very sharp swing, and it perfectly illustrates his point about dualism and power structures. Parwez addresses the concept of marifat.
Marifat, what does that mean in this context?
In mystical traditions, it means attaining a deep, esoteric, personal knowledge of or friendship with God. Some mystical poets, and he famously cites a concept often attributed to the tradition of Rumi, suggested that this mystical connection is the true marrow or essence of religion.
The marrow, okay, so the inner hidden core.
Right, and that the practical, structural, legal aspects of religion are just the bones that you throw to the dogs.
Bones for the dogs. Wow. That is an incredibly elitist way to view the actual rules of how a society should run.
It really is.
It essentially says that the laws governing how we treat the poor, how we distribute wealth, how we ensure justice, are just trivial matters for the unenlightened.
For the dogs. And Parwez vehemently rejects this. He argues that this mystical escapist approach is actually incredibly convenient for the ruling class.
Because it pacifies the workers.
Exactly. If you can convince the oppressed masses that the real religion is just inward meditation and accepting their worldly suffering as God's mysterious will, you effectively neutralize them as a political force.
You act as a pressure valve for the revolution. You vent the frustration into the afterlife instead of into the streets.
The elites get to keep running the economy, hoarding the resources, and making the laws the so-called bones, while the masses are distracted trying to achieve mystical enlightenment or waiting for their reward after they die.
Parwez is essentially making the same structural critique as the opiate of the masses argument, just from within a Quranic framework.
He is. He says the Quran never asks humans to achieve an impossible mystical comprehension of an infinite God. A finite human mind cannot comprehend the infinite.
So what does the text actually ask for?
It asks for something much more practical and demanding: the establishment of a just, equitable, socio-economic system on Earth. That structural justice is the true measure of faith in his framework, not how deeply you can meditate.
To illustrate the real-world consequences of this dualism, this setup, where elites make the rules and hoard the resources while the masses suffer or are told to pray away their hunger. Parwez doesn't just use abstract economic theory.
No, he uses very concrete analogy.
Right, he brings in this incredibly vivid analogy. It's originally a historical example, a parable from the Prophet Muhammad dating back over 1,400 years, found in the Sahih Bukhari collections. But Parwez maps it onto modern economics in a way that is just devastating.
The boat analogy.
The boat analogy. It is a brilliant, devastatingly simple encapsulation of societal hierarchy and resource distribution.
For you listening, try to visualize this. Society is a boat. It's a multi-level ship navigating the ocean of existence. Now, the wealthy, the powerful, the elites, the ruling class, they have secured the upper deck.
They have the best views, the fresh air, the luxury.
And most importantly, they have absolute control over the ship's resources. Meanwhile, the oppressed masses, the working class, the marginalized, they are relegated to the lower deck.
It's cramped, it's dark down there in the hull. They are doing all the heavy labor to keep the ship moving, and they are entirely dependent on the upper deck for survival.
And the most critical resource in this analogy, the one that drives the entire conflict, is water.
Water, which makes sense for a boat.
In Parwez's structural mapping, water represents the fundamental socio-economic necessities of life: capital, food, shelter, healthcare. Basically, the basic means of sustaining human existence.
The people on the lower deck need water simply to survive. But to get it, they have to go to the upper deck. And what happens? The people on the upper deck start to get annoyed.
Of course they do.
They complain that the lower class is bothering them. They say, you're tracking dirt onto our pristine deck. You're disrupting our peace. You're demanding too much water.
So the upper deck decides to restrict access. They start putting up barriers, demanding impossible tolls, effectively choking off the life supply to the lower deck.
It makes me think of modern realities immediately. Like billionaires buying up vast tracts of land with private water rights in drought-stricken areas.
Or building luxury survival bunkers in New Zealand while the public infrastructure around the rest of the world just crumbles.
Exactly. The upper deck is hoarding the water. And historically, as we were just discussing with the dualism and the mystical escapism, traditional systems told the people in the lower deck to just accept this arrangement.
They were told, this is your fate. God put you on the lower deck for a reason. Be patient. Endure the thirst, don't rock the boat, and you'll get an ocean of water in the afterlife.
But Parwez's rational structural reading of the text says the exact opposite. It says the lower deck has an absolute, undeniable right to that water.
It is not a privilege granted by the upper deck. It is a fundamental requirement of the universal law of sustenance that Rububiyah we talked about earlier.
Which raises the ultimate pressure cooker question for this whole analogy. If the lower deck has an absolute right to the water, and the upper deck absolutely refuses to share it, what is the inevitable outcome?
Parwez, drawing on this ancient parable, points out the stark biological and sociological reality here. The people on the lower deck are human beings. They are driven by the imperative to survive.
They aren't just going to quietly fade away.
Right. If they are denied access to the water above, they will not just quietly lay down and die of thirst to preserve the peace of the upper deck. They will be forced to look for water below.
Below the boat, meaning the ocean?
Exactly. They will take whatever tools they have, and they will start drilling a hole in the bottom of the boat to get to the ocean beneath them.
And if they drill a hole in the bottom of the boat, the entire boat sinks.
The entire thing goes down, the upper deck, the lower deck, everyone perishes.
The entire societal structure collapses under the weight of its own inequity.
That is the mechanical consequence of shirk. The artificial buffer the elites created fails. The society collapses. And that profound, inevitable collapse brings us to Parwez's redefinition of one of the most misunderstood and frankly heavily mythologized concepts in the entire text. Qiyamah.
When most people hear the Islamic equivalent of doomsday, the apocalypse, the end of the world, they picture a massive cinematic disaster movie scenario.
Right, very supernatural.
The sun crashing into the earth, fire raining from the sky, graves splitting open, zombies rising from the dirt. It's entirely supernatural. How does Parwez translate a cosmic apocalypse into socioeconomics? Because he strips the supernatural element out completely.
He does. He goes back to the Arabic roots in the grammar again. The word qiyamah comes from the root word kafwa mim, QWM.
And what does that mean?
It simply means to stand up, to rise, or to establish. Furthermore, the specific grammatical form used in Arabic, which is often an intensive or sudden form, implies a sudden, collective, almost explosive standing up.
So it's an uprising.
Parwez frames Qiyamah not as a supernatural science fiction apocalypse where the physical universe randomly explodes, but as an inevitable sudden socioeconomic revolution. It is the breaking point of the boat analogy.
The moment the drilling starts, or rather the moment the lower deck decides to storm the upper deck instead of drowning in the hole.
It is the moment the global masses referred to in the Quranic text as an-nas, the people finally realize they are being starved.
It's the moment they reject the false narratives of the upper deck. They reject the escapist theology that told them to pacify their hunger with prayer.
And they collectively stand up against the hoarding of resources. It is a massive structural uprising to dismantle the artificial systems of shirk and establish a universal system of economic justice.
Qiyamah is a social revolution. That makes so much sense in this framework. Let's dig into the specific imagery used in the text to describe this, because Surah Az-Zumar uses very specific, highly visual metaphors.
It does.
Parwez analyzes verse 68, which mentions the blowing of the trumpet, or the Surah. In traditional imagery, across multiple religions actually, that's interpreted as an angel, usually Israfil or Gabriel, literally blowing a giant horn from the heavens to wake the dead from their physical graves.
A literal trumpet waking up skeletons.
Yeah. If we are strictly applying a socioeconomic, rational lens, how on earth do you interpret a giant cosmic trumpet waking up skeletons?
Parwez offers a breathtakingly grounded interpretation of this. He looks at the function of a trumpet or a horn in historical human societies.
It was a communication mechanism.
Exactly. It was a rallying cry used to signal a charge, a gathering, or a sudden change in state on a battlefield. He suggests that the oppressed masses, having been ground down by centuries of deprivation, exploitation, and false ideologies, have effectively become dead.
Not biologically dead.
No, politically, socially, and intellectually dead. They're like lifeless clay figures, completely stripped of their agency, their dignity, and their awareness of their own collective power.
So they're walking corpses, the ultimate alienated workforce, just going through the motions to survive, completely dead inside.
The blowing of the Surah, the trumpet, represents the sudden, electrifying injection of revolutionary consciousness. It is the spread of a liberating ideology.
A sudden realization of their fundamental rights.
It's the moment the idea takes hold that the elites on the upper deck are not untouchable gods, and that the resources of the earth actually belong to everyone equally.
When that realization, that revolutionary spirit, is breathed into the lifeless masses, they suddenly wake up and rise to claim their rights. It's a political and social awakening, a mass mobilization, not a literal zombie resurrection.
It completely flips the entire narrative. It takes a text that for centuries has been read as a terrifying passive wait for the end of time.
And turns it into an active manual for social change.
Right.
But this brings up a massive question regarding the aftermath. Because if Qiyamah is the revolution, the uprising, the tearing down of the old system,
Yeah.
then what are heaven and hell?
Because traditionally, those are the final eternal destinations after the apocalypse.
Exactly. Does Parwez bring Jannah heaven and Jahannam hell down to earth as well?
Structural consistency requires it. If the ultimate authority is a socio-economic law and the uprising is a social revolution, then heaven and hell must be the resulting societal states that humans build for themselves on this earth.
Okay, let's break them down. What is hell in this earthly framework?
Parwez looks at the root of Jahannam, or hell, which comes from Jim Hamim, J-H-M. This root implies a glaring, frowning, or a sudden stopping of movement.
A stopping of movement, so stagnation.
He defines hell not as a mystical pit of fire in the afterlife, but as earthly economic deprivation, tight sustenance, and the horrific societal collapse that happens when the boat finally sinks.
So the fire of hell is the fire of social friction.
Yes.
It's crime, poverty, inflation burning through savings, structural violence, civil war. When you force people to drill a hole in the boat, the resulting chaos, destruction, and terror that is Jahannam on earth.
It's the consequence of defying the immutable socioeconomic law. It's the equivalent of stepping off the cliff and hitting the ground, but played out on a macro societal level over generations.
And conversely, what about heaven? Jannah?
Jannah comes from the root Jim Nun Nun, J-N-N, which means something concealed, protected, or a lush, flourishing garden.
Parwez defines this not as a cloudy resort in the sky, right?
No, he defines it as a tangible, functioning socioeconomic model of prosperity, equity, and protection right here on Earth. It is the ideal society that is built after the successful Qiyamah.
After the masses have stood up and successfully established the universal law of Rubiyyah,
Exactly.
Parwez actually goes into specific detail in his writings about what this earthly heaven looks like. And honestly, to a modern ear, it sounds suspiciously like a perfectly functioning Scandinavian welfare state, but taken to an even more robust absolute extreme. He breaks it down into two main freedoms. What are they?
This is where Parwez's critique of modern capitalism becomes incredibly sharp and specific. He highlights that in this earthly Jannah, the foundational characteristic is freedom from want.
Freedom from want.
He cites Quranic verses stating that in this state of Jannah, no one will suffer from hunger, no one will lack clothing, no one will suffer from thirst, and no one will be without adequate shelter.
So universal basic needs are unconditionally met.
These are guaranteed baselines for every single human being, simply by virtue of them being human.
Yeah, they are not commodities to be earned or bought. They are fundamental rights ensured by the Universal Constitution. Freedom from want. I mean, if you don't have to worry about starving, freezing, or going bankrupt because you got sick, your entire psychological state changes.
Completely.
You are no longer operating in a perpetual state of stress and survival mode. You're not fighting for scraps on the lower deck anymore.
And that psychological liberation leads directly to the second freedom Parwez identifies, freedom to act, which we might also call freedom of movement or agency.
How does that look in practice?
He moots that in this ideal society, people are free to move, to innovate, and to act without unjust restrictions, oppressive borders, or the crushing, paralyzing constraints of poverty.
It's a society of immense liberty. But it is a liberty grounded first and foremost in absolute economic security. You cannot be truly free if you are starving.
Exactly. You can't innovate if you're working 3 jobs just to pay rent.
I need to pause here and ask the classic, deeply ingrained capitalist question. The welfare queen critique, so to speak.
Yeah.
If everyone is guaranteed food, clothing, and shelter, regardless of what they do, who actually does the work?
Right, the incentive argument.
Does everyone just sit around in this earthly heaven eating grapes? How does Parwez handle the concept of labor and productivity in this rational system? Because the standard economic fear is that if you guarantee basic survival, human beings become inherently lazy and society stagnates.
Parwez anticipates this exact critique, and his framework delivers a radical redefinition of the value and reward of labor. In his rational Jannah, labor is absolutely paramount. It is the engine of the society.
So it's not a post-work utopia.
Not at all. He points to the recurring Quranic emphasis on ajr al-amalin, which translates to the reward of the workers or those who act in labor.
The reward of the workers.
Okay.
Parwez argues that in our current capitalist system, wages are an artificial construct dictated by the elite on the upper deck.
Right. An employer, driven entirely by the profit motive, decides your labor is worth $10 an hour, regardless of whether that $10 can actually pay for your rent, your food, or your health care.
The wage is completely disconnected from your actual biological need, and more importantly, it is disconnected from the true value of what you actually produced.
It's an arbitrary number assigned by someone holding unaccountable power,
Yeah.
designed to extract surplus value from you.
The employer is acting as the arbitrary Ela, the sovereign authority in that microeconomy. They make the rules, they extract the value, and the worker just has to accept the crumbs.
But in the Quranic alternative that Parwez outlines, the reward system is mathematically just and directly tied to effort and the full product of that effort. Yes, he heavily relies on the Quranic principle found in Surah An-Najm, verse 39, Laisa lil insani illa masa, which translates to, man gets nothing but what he strives for.
Man gets nothing but what he strives for, so you cannot reap the benefits of this society without putting in the labor.
Parwez is completely rejecting passive income, rent-seeking, absentee landlordism, and wealth hoarding. There is no upper deck where elites sit idly while extracting value from the lower deck's labor.
Wow. So if you don't work, you don't exploit the system. The workers receive the full return of their labor. The society is structured so that human effort, physical or intellectual, is the only currency of value.
And that value is never sectioned off by a non-working ownership class. Precisely. The reward isn't a minimum wage dictated by a boss. It's the full, equitable share of the societal wealth you helped create.
This earthly heaven isn't an escape from work, it's an escape from exploitation.
It's a society of intense, meaningful labor, but labor where you are absolutely guaranteed not just basic survival, but the full, unexploited fruits of your work.
And this circles back to the overarching theme of universal justice. If the physical universe operates on perfect, balanced laws that ensure the sustenance of everything from galaxies to atoms, human society must operate on a perfect, balanced socio-economic law.
A law that ensures the complete sustenance and unexploited reward of every single human being. That, according to Parwez, is the true meaning of establishing the sovereignty of God on earth.
We have covered massive paradigm-shifting ground here today.
We really have.
We started with redefining the very vocabulary of religion, taking worship from a private ritual to active adherence to a constitution.
The paved road.
We moved to redefining ultimate authority, not as a mystical being demanding praise, but as an immutable law of socioeconomic justice, mirroring the absolute laws of physics like gravity.
We explored the devastating critique of dualism, the hypocrisy of accepting absolute laws in nature, but allowing elites to rule human society arbitrarily.
We visualized the chilling inevitability of the societal boat sinking when the lower deck is denied water and resources.
And we completely flipped the script on Qiyamah, heaven, and hell.
Framing them not as a cosmic horror movie in an afterlife resort, but as a sudden social revolution, leading either to catastrophic societal collapse or an earthly paradise of guaranteed rights and unexploited labor.
What Parwez has done in this 1981 lecture is take a text that has been treated for centuries as a mystical roadmap to the afterlife, and he has re-engineered it, or rather, he would argue, restored it into a radical, intensely practical blueprint for a rationally governed, economically just civilization.
Whether a listener fully agrees with his structuralism or prefers traditional theology, his framework forces a completely different conversation.
It argues that a society only truly functions, only truly survives the test of time, when its socioeconomic laws are treated with the exact same reverence, immutability, and absolute authority as the law of gravity.
It fundamentally removes the elite's ability to hoard resources, dictate arbitrary wages, or claim unaccountable sovereignty.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, navigating the immense complexities and inequalities of our current world?
It provides a profound lens through which to view systemic inequality. When you look at extreme poverty, when you look at massive wealth gaps, when you see the struggles of the working class against entrenched corporate or political power, Parwez's framework says this is not an accident of nature.
It is not the mysterious will of a divine being testing our patience.
And it is certainly not a sustainable status quo. It is a structural failure. It is the active implementation of shirk. Humans elevating their own flawed, selfish systems above the universal law of equity.
And most importantly, it is a mathematical certainty that this failure inevitably leads to the masses drilling a hole in the boat.
It forces us to examine our own participation in these systems. Are we accepting the dualism? Are we content to acknowledge scientific reality while turning a blind eye to socioeconomic reality?
Parwez's reading demands active, structural participation in justice, not passive acceptance.
Which leaves us with a final lingering thought, a provocation, really, to mull over as you step back out into the world. If a true heaven isn't a magical afterlife waiting for us after we die, but rather a society built here, right now, on absolute economic equity, the eradication of poverty, and the full, unexploited reward of human labor.
Look around at the institutions, the economies, and the political structures we participate in every single day.
Are the social systems we are building creating a boat that will eventually float in harmony with universal laws? Or by ignoring the thirst of the lower deck, are we just forcing the people below to reach for the drill?